say the commissioner will walk us through sort of where the report fits within a time frame of a number of activities that in fact were underway that respond to some of the concerns in that report. So we'll just have a chance to debrief in person since it sort of came out just before the holiday and we hadn't had a conversation about residential placement since August. Welcome Patty and Joan, and I already welcomed our new colleague, David Cruz. And then we'll move to a subsidy regulation revision and an update on the QRS work. Secretary does not have any comments.
Actually, I told you I didn't have any comments,
Sure.
but just let me jump in quickly and add my welcome to Dave. Dave's, I think, going to be a great member, not only because he brings a depth of current experience with, from an employer's perspective, representing the Regional Employment Board in Hampton County, but also coming from the public school system in Springfield. He's got including experience in the early education space as well. So I think he's bringing a lot of value to bear. So he's going to be a great member. I have high hopes. Don't let me down, Dave. I know it'll be great, but I also just wanted to acknowledge JD and his service. And we'll have a chance, I'm sure, to celebrate JD's service. But he essentially goes back really to the beginning of this agency. He has served in multiple leadership roles over time. He has been a dedicated and effective board member and advocate, not just for the agency, but for children and for the early education system as a whole. And he'll be greatly missed. Dave will easily match, his contributions, but nonetheless, there are big shoes to fill. And so I just want to acknowledge and thank JD for his service.
Absolutely, and we'll certainly organize a chance to formally acknowledge JD's contributions over the years. And somehow the new brewery below, something about that just conjures up convenient and JD. So thanks. Commissioner.
Thank you, Chair. Happy New Year to the members of the board and to the members of the public and to the EEC staff who are present here today, and welcome aboard, Dave. Looking forward to working with you in your capacity as a board member. I have a small number of updates that I want to provide before we move into the meat of the agenda. The first set of updates are all covering IT projects, just to give you a sense of the amount of time and attention that we're putting into some critical components of the major IT projects at the agency. We are presently working to move into phase 3 of the LEAD project. This phase of work will allow us to maximize the provider portal communication, the provider experience within the LEAD system. It's one of our opportunities to automate components of the work and streamline communication between the agency and providers. So we're looking forward to that piece of work. The background record check system, which we'll be talking about more in the course of the first presentation today, is moving ahead, and we still expect that the project will be launched for use in the early part of 2018. There's a lot of efforts that are underway right now to complete the development of that system, but also to move us through the user acceptance testing and ensure that we have the appropriate level of training and communication in place, because this is going to be a big change for this agency and especially for the field, which will be utilizing that system. We are also continuing to move forward, although we talk about it less these days, and that's kind of a nice thing, but with further improvements to CCFA that still continue to take attention from our agency. Big components of that are automating some of the auditing functions of our agency, the legal components of our contracting as well, and some further integration into what's known as the MARS system, which will enable us to continue to automate components of our billing process which still are not fully automated. So it will really give us a better chance of having a push-button approach to the billing and payment process. And that's already been advanced quite substantially within the current system, but there are still other opportunities if we can connect it to the state's billing system, and that's what's happening in the course of this work. Likewise, we're preparing CCFA for any changes that are made to our regulations, particularly the subsidy regulations, which we're going to have our first preliminary conversation on today. Those final changes to the subsidy regulations almost certainly are going to compel some further changes to CCFA, so we're starting to make preparations in anticipation of those changes. And finally, I wanted to note that another system which is not presently in the pipeline of development, but is a major priority of ours, is a system that would support our workforce development activities. It's what we're ultimately going to come up with a new name for, but we presently call our Integrated Workforce Development System. This would incorporate what is currently the Teacher Qualifications System, the Professional Qualifications Registry, potentially the QRAS as well, into one system that also would provide us, by the way, a learning management system, so a platform for EEC to provide professional development online. That we are presently sizing up to make a capital request for the FY19 cycle for IT capital projects. So we're working on that and plan on submitting that over the course of the next month. And I'm very pleased to announce that we had an opportunity presented to us very late in 2017 by the federal government. There was some additional funding within the preschool expansion grant program. And they reached out to states to ask if states would be interested in one-time funding for any kind of a system reform project. And lo and behold, we thought we could really use a learning management system. So Jocelyn Bone undertook an effort to put together a proposal quickly, and we secured $1.25 million, which is going to allow us to begin work on developing and procuring the learning management system. So we're really, really excited about that, and I'm very grateful to Jocelyn for her activities in that regard, and we've incorporated that into the proposal that we're going to be making to the Commonwealth for further IT capital funding to support a build-out beyond just the LMS. The LMS that we're hoping to procure, and it will be an open procurement process, but we hope it will have features similar to the LMS that's used in states such as Colorado, which actually does enable for integration of a PQ and a TQ function to that LMS. And so we're optimistic that it will allow us to address a number of the needs that we have within our workforce development agenda. Finally, I just want to note within our teacher qualifications work, our teacher qualifications unit took one of the biggest hits within the early retirement program. And we've had the ability through the hiring process this year to bring 2 additional staff people to that unit. That has allowed us to take a backlog on teacher qualifications, which was approximately a handful of months. And at this point, we've reduced that down, and it continues to be reduced down to about 45 days right now. And it's trending in the right direction. So we've been able to make really significant progress there. And this is obviously one component of our efforts to be responsive to the field in terms of helping them to onboard people as quickly as possible. There are other things that we are working on that also address our workforce needs and challenges, but that's an important one, and I just wanted to note that, and again, thank Alicia Syrian-Wells and the teacher qualification unit for the work that they've done in making that progress. That is the extent of my report, and I'm happy to answer any questions on those items or to address any other issues that may arise from the board. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We have one request for public comment from Naomi Meyer of the Greater Boston Legal Services on the topic of transportation.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Hi, as you heard, I'm Naomi Meyer from Greater Boston Legal Services. I work in the Welfare Law Unit, and most of our clients receive child care subsidies, so I wanted to come and share our concern about the proposal that we've heard to restrict transportation as being paid for as part of the voucher. We know lots of families don't use the transportation and don't need it, and that's terrific. But for those who do, it can often be essential and be the difference between whether they're going to be able to keep the schedule, keep their job or not. And so I wanted to share with you a statement from one of my clients who could not be here today because she is working. But She had a lot to say about this. I'd like to read a shortened version, and I have copies that I can hand out to you as well. Dear members of the board, I'm writing to express my concern about the proposal for EEC to stop providing transportation to daycare for children who need it. I am totally against this proposal. As a single mom of a 3-year-old with no car and not much of a support system, it would really create a downward spiral in my everyday life. When I first had my daughter Cadence, we were homeless and we needed TFDC benefits on and off. The daycare didn't provide transportation, so I was taking her back and forth from our shelter in Brighton to her daycare and then taking myself to work in Chestnut Hill on the T. Our commute every day would take us 2 hours to get to the destination and then 2 hours back home. It was exhausting. Now I work at Faulkner Hospital as a full-time unit coordinator, and I have an income eligible voucher. I start very early in the morning, and the transportation offered by the new daycare makes my commute to work possible. I would not be able to take my daughter to school in the morning and still arrive at work on time, so I could lose my job if transportation is not provided. This is why I feel it is imperative to continue to have transportation available. Having transportation is critical in order for me to maintain my job and continue to have a schedule that works for me and my daughter. Thank you for your time to hear me out. Sincerely, Jokina Adams.
Thank you. So just to make a few comments and for Dave's benefit, no decisions on transportation is simply an area that the agency has started to look into in terms of efficiency, cost effectiveness, the rates. We're not paying very much for transportation, and so how do we find the balance between the cost and the health and safety? Certainly no proposals on the table, but a set of recommendations as a function of a study that a consulting group undertook for us. So it is, just to be clear, on our agenda this month, the commissioner and I, to kind of return to that and think through how we might work this through next steps and with all of you. That's where we're at. Thank you very much for your public comment. I think now we'll move into our items for discussion. We'll start with the OIG audit. We'll sort of aim for roughly 30 minutes per item through these next three.
It's only fair that I get to see it from this perspective. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Commissioner Tom Weber, and as I always am, very glad to be joined by Deputy Commissioner Carmel Sullivan and our General Counsel, Felicia Sullivan. Carmel and Felicia and I all worked in conjunction with DCF on the OIG audit response in collaboration with the Department of Children and Families. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to make this presentation, and because of their intimate involvement, Carmel and Felicia are joining me in case there's any questions that you have. I will be happy to answer those. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services OIG audit of this program, and also to provide you with an update on the items that EEC has been working on that relate to some of the findings, and already has plans in place to deliver on, and also have a conversation with you about any other opportunities that may exist in order for us to further improve our work in this area. So with that, I'd like to move into the background on slide 2. I think as would be familiar to folks here, this Office of the Inspector General, like all others, is established by in this case, federal agency, Health and Human Services, to ensure that the programs that are being funded through Health and Human Services are protecting the safety and welfare of its recipients. This particular series of audits that were undertaken by the HHS OIG were undertaken after there were some high-profile stories that raised concerns, in particular about the welfare of children in group foster care homes, and there's been a substantial number of these audits conducted across many states in the nation. And the findings of those audits are that there are a significant percentage of providers in which there are potentially hazardous conditions and noncompliances with their state's health and safety requirements. Specifically, what the OIG was looking at here was the Title IV foster care program, and that is awarded by the Administration for Children and Families in Massachusetts. The OIG reviewed the Department of Children and Families, which is the administrator of this program, and EEC, which licenses the group home licenses for the residential programs associated with this program. The audit covered the period from January 1st through the end of December of 2015, and the report was released on December 18th of 2017, this past month, and I had sent a communication to you the following day with a summary of what had taken place in the course of that time. The methodology that the OIG used was to look at all 101 of the Massachusetts group homes that were recipients of Title IV funding, and then they narrowed for purposes of conducting visits to 30 group homes that were part of the DCF Caring Together contract. The OIG conducted unannounced visits with DCF in May of 2016. EEC was in constant communication with DCF throughout that process, so as issues were identified, we were able to respond in real time, and we can get to how that played out as we get a little further along. But that's how the process worked in terms of the group home visits. With respect to the background record check component of their findings, the OIG asked EEC's IT system to create reports to verify completion of the background record checks. And then it provided us with lists of the employees' names that required a further electronic report to be run through our system to verify compliance with those regulations. And across all this, the standard of review is consistent with standard auditing practices to ensure that the sample is large enough to make conclusions. And I see.
I'm sorry, do you want to question it, or do you want to wait till the end?
Oh, no, I'm happy to take questions at
Okay,
any time.
Just a point of clarification, because I'm not maybe familiar with this. The audit period was January to December of 15, yet the visits were in May of 16. Can you just speak to that for a minute and help me to understand why it was after the audit period?
After that the visits were made after the audit period?
Yeah.
So they were
clarifying visits, or?
So the site visits themselves were not conducted until after the audit period. I think that they had conducted an audit of all 101 programs and then selected those 30 amongst those for site visits that followed that original review period. And they're looking at documentation from the beginning of that calendar year through the end of that calendar year. So that's the window that they had landed on for review of materials.
Okay.
Is that sufficient to answer your question?
But just,
So is the data a year old that they're basing their, how old is the data that they're basing their recommendations on?
So the data that they're basing the recommendations on, it is a point in time that they're looking at. So they conducted the visits, and all of the facility issues that were identified within the report were from those visits that were conducted in May of 2016. The activity with respect to the background record checks, we continue to work with them through and up through this summer on that information. So yes, the information is not
Updated.
not fully updated, But this is, I will say, although I'm not here to speak to standard auditing practices, that is consistent with how most audits are conducted. There needs to be a defined point in time, and oftentimes the findings follow after a review period.
So in essence, whatever the findings were, and we've all heard pieces of that, included findings from the visits in 2016.
Correct.
Thank you.
So a summary of what they did find in their visits in May of 2016. Among the 30 group homes were that 27 did not comply with one or more requirements for the living units. There are examples provided for what they found in each of these categories, and probably for purposes of being sensitive to time, I won't read through each and every one. I'll just touch on a few of the examples. So a general lack of assurance around ongoing cleanliness and repairs, in some cases ripped or unsatisfactory materials within the living units. 26% rather of the 30 programs did not comply with one or more requirements for building or grounds, including some cases of infestation, expired first aid kits, disrepair of some of their equipment, and childproofing issues. 20 did not comply with one or more requirements for bathing and toilet facilities, including, again, a general lack of cleanliness and repairs, the lack of adequate slip surfaces, and a lack of storage space for toiletries. 11 group homes did not comply with one or more requirements for toxic substances, including having made accessible chemicals for cleaning agents and products. And in 15 group homes, they didn't meet the state requirements regarding the proper cleanliness and storage for food items. Some were not stored properly or labeled properly, and there was an instance in which there was a box of spoiled food, which I'm sure if you looked at the pictures, might have been among the ones that jumped out at you as well. I'm not sure if anybody would have accepted those bananas. So in all those cases, those issues were addressed before the audit was completed and released. Again, as I noted earlier, we were in regular communication with the Department of Children and Family staff who accompanied the OIG on this. So as issues were being identified, EEC staff was alerted, and we were able to follow up through the licensors directly with programs to make sure that those matters were brought into compliance in a timely fashion.
Can I ask you a question? Were these issues that were found, were they ongoing issues that the licenses might have been made aware of and were working with them anyways? Or were they new items that were found?
And I don't know if Carmel might have any further insight into this. I don't believe that they were issues that were previously identified in any of our other visits. They were, I think in most, if not all cases, new items that had been identified. Again, these were unannounced visits, so that is a feature of that as well, and a feature of what the OIG recommends by way of a change in practice, and one that we had already been anticipating, and we'll talk a little bit more about that.
We were not aware of any of these being systemic issues, if that's what you mean, Jim, for any of these programs.
Yeah, I don't know at all.
And do we do unannounced visits as well?
So starting this past fall, and we'll explain a little bit about how we got there. We have started a process of unannounced visits, and that will be our practice for all programs licensed by EEC on an ongoing basis. So that's part of the differential licensing work that we've discussed over the last several years and that we've been developing since the fall of 2013. And that's why we undertook, in large measure, the development of the LEAD system, which was to give us a platform to organize our differential licensing work. A big component of differential licensing is the use of unannounced visits. So our practice has not been, up until this point in time, to use unannounced visits except for circumstances in which we have suspicion of noncompliance or an awareness of noncompliance, in which case, as a matter of practice, we do use unannounced visits. This will become the standard practice for us in terms of our ongoing regular licensing work. With respect to the background record check findings, just a little bit of a background. So as you know, the EEC BRC requirements include a CORI as well as a DCF check and a check against the state sex offender registry, as well as starting in 2014, a fingerprint-based check of the National Criminal History Database. To implement fingerprinting, EEC designed its process so that candidates receive a fingerprint notification letter informing candidates that they need to schedule an appointment for fingerprinting within 21 days. Our current process is that programs are responsible for monitoring their staff's compliance with these requirements. A piece that I wanted to raise here, which isn't to in any way, shape, or form challenge or invalidate the OIG's finding, it's just an important, I think, consideration to point out is that EEC's regulations and policies don't require that the fingerprinting be complete within a period of time. The OIG, for purposes of wanting to create a standard for a reasonable period of time, determined that they would apply a 60-day period of time. So the findings that they have connect to the OIG standard for that 60 days. Now, just as a side note, but quite relevant, that issue of wanting to ensure completion is really paramount and really was important to this agency before the OIG audit, and certainly as we consider the OIG's findings. The new system that we're developing is going to allow us to track and monitor completion of all elements of the background record check. The legacy systems, the existing systems that we're working on, don't have that tracking capability, so we're going to be able to track each element of the background record check, including the fingerprint completion. And furthermore, we're going to be able to track the hiring decision associated with that. Again, another feature that we're presently not able to track within our existing system. All of those things will give us a much clearer picture into what's happening within the background record check process. So we're looking forward to that as advancements within this work. So as a result of its audit, the OIG determined that 18 homes did not comply with one or more of the BRC requirements, and within that, they looked at populations that were hired on or after September 1st of 2013, and those that were hired prior to September 1st of 2013. So they determined that 99 employees total within those hired on or after September 1st of 2013 had not been fingerprinted within their 60-day standard. They determined within that category that 5 employees had not received their CORI, DCF, or SORI checks prior to employment or thereafter. 1 employee did not receive a SORI check prior to employment or thereafter, and 1 employee did not receive a DCF or SORI check prior to employment or thereafter. Within the category of employees that were hired prior to September 1st of 2013, 42 had not completed fingerprints by September 1st of 2016. 3 had not completed a SORI check by September 1st. 3 had not completed a CORI and DCF check by September 1st, and 1 did not complete a DCF or SORI check by December 1st. What I wanted to point out here in the notation below is that with the exception of a small number of these individuals who are still in process, and we're tracking those individuals, all of the above issues have been addressed within the BRC system. And we've had multiple communications with programs, both in a general way and in a direct way through their licensors, that no employee who has an incomplete background record check is to be in unsupervised contact with any youth. So for those that are in process, they've been notified that they're not to have unsupervised contact with youth. Any questions? Okay. So with respect to the Officer and Inspector General recommendations and responses in our progress, the recommendations really fall into 4 categories that are listed here in the left-hand column. The first is to ensure that there is correction of all non-compliances of EEC regulations. And as I noted, because we had the ability to work in real time with DCF and with the OIG, we were able to respond to those matters, and there's 100% completion for those physical facility non-compliances. A second recommendation was that DCF add contract requirements to ensure that there's the conduct of repairs and general upkeep within a specified time frame, and that's a matter that we know through our ongoing work with DCF that they are looking at as they think about restructuring the next contract. And I think that that's a really good opportunity for further collaboration between our agencies as that contract is designed, and I have perfect confidence that there'll be coordination between the agencies on that matter. The third item that they recommended was that we increase the frequency of announced visits and include unannounced visits as part of our monitoring protocol. And as I noted, that is in fact a critical component of the design for our differential licensing work and for the lead system development. And on the next slide, I'll show you sort of the timeline for which that's come to pass. But we initiated that this past fall. That was our plan prior to the release of this OIG report. So we didn't touch that timeline. It's precisely how we had intended to move forward. And we intend to have it fully implemented by the end of fiscal year 2019. We're doing it on a rolling basis, picking up programs as they would have been scheduled for their next licensing visit. But we've already begun to introduce the unannounced visit component to our work. Then the final recommendation brought to us by the OIG was that DCF and EEC continue to work to implement adequate monitoring controls to ensure that group home employees receive required background record checks. As I noted from the previous slide, we have a specific process that we've undertaken with respect to the non-compliances identified within the OIG report. But most importantly, or at least as importantly, is the systemic reforms that we're looking to bring forward and implement. The background record check system right now, from an IT development standpoint, is about 60 to 75% complete, and we expect its release in the early part of 2018. And it's going to bring about a number of the tools that are necessary for us to monitor the system in a much more exact way than we previously have been able to monitor it. So that system is a really important part of what we think is necessary to do this work at the high level that the agency has wanted to do it at since passage of the 2013 state law and passage of the Child Care Development Block Grant. Any questions with respect to that?
I have a question.
Sure. Allison?
Of course, this is all very logical, and I just wonder about identifying the recommendations. Was there some sort of root cause analysis that was done that is sort of behind the scenes, or because it feels like a lot of this is putting out fires?
Sure. I think that gets to perhaps, which is not among their recommendations, but one of the items that we're going to identify in terms of other ongoing work that we see related to that. Ultimately, this comes down to, in large measure, on practice, right? The individuals, the adults that populate this work, that are working with this youth population. And, you know, we've long believed, and this is why the agency has really worked to actively promote the workforce as the issue that we need to focus on, that training and professional development need to be a component of this. I think, you know, this is a field which I know you appreciate, is often not trained at a high level, is generally employed, you know, at wages which are not highly competitive. And I think it's not dissimilar in that respect to other components of the fields that our department works with, and the populations that we work principally with. In this case, however, I think as everybody knows, the nature of this work is often quite acute because of the populations, the children that we're talking about. And so some of those issues that I just discussed in terms of perhaps a lack of training and a lack of ongoing professional development, and the challenges of even identifying staffing are even more pronounced in this environment. And our staff certainly here has been raising that and surfacing that in the course of their work. So I think our feeling about the root cause analysis is that we've got to be attentive to that if we really want to see you know, a systemic change. The features of system change that I've discussed so far are, you know, are important. Those are going to be important elements, but ultimately we're relying on the adults that are participating within this work, and so we're really going to have to make a concerted effort there. And that's a focus of work for the Child Advocate, and it's a focus of work for this agency, and we're planning on working with DCF and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and the OCA in MAPS, which is one of the larger provider associations for some of these approved private schools, to identify what the training needs and training supports are and see if we might be able to be more responsive to those in the upcoming year. So we have meetings that we are just about to put on the books to make that happen. And I'm open to any other thoughts or comments folks have in that regard. John?
Focusing on workforce training and perhaps even some management training, because it seems that some number of these issues are really tied into the leadership of the individual group homes and management decisions that are being made there. Seems like a really wonderful next piece of work. I'm wondering, as you talk about all the different pieces of the system that are underway that are in some manner going to address the issues raised by the OIG's report, how will we know if we're being successful? And what is the standard that we want to hold ourselves to? Is it typical when licensors go out into the field that roughly 90% of programs have a health or safety violation? So how do we understand the 27 out of 30 finding, for example? And what is it that we think improvements through LEAD and BRC and additional staffing within RMP are going to get us in terms of actual results on the ground? So have you had a chance to do any thinking along those lines, and how might we think about what our goals are for this segment of the work that, as everyone I think here knows, doesn't often get all the attention that it probably needs and deserves?
Excellent points, thank you. So to answer that question, we have pretty exacting licensing standards for these programs as well as for our child care programs. They're considered by many to be the strongest or among the very strongest in the nation. In almost every instance when we would make an unannounced visit, we would find a non-compliance. So these findings are consistent across all categories of care that we have. It's not uncommon for us to find at least one non-compliance, and so the 90% that you reference is probably not inconsistent with what we would find through a practice of unannounced visits. You raise a very, very good point, which is how are we going to measure our progress in this regard? First thing I would note is that our present systems don't allow us to track non-compliances in a very sophisticated way, whereas LEAD is being designed in a way to give us much, much stronger data about what exactly is happening in programs. So we're going to have a stronger data set under LEAD than we're presently working with. The second piece I would note is that this question that you raise about what are really the critical measurements within these programs is exactly the question that the Child Advocates Working Group, which is convening EEC, ESC, DCF, the Department of Mental Health, the Disabled Persons Protection Commission, and maybe missing one other, but there's another HHS agency perhaps involved as well. That's actually what we're all trying to work around, is to try to establish a common criteria across the agencies so that one, we have the benefit of each agency informing each other in that exercise, but also each agency then reinforcing each other in its own work to try to accomplish that goal. So that is sort of in a more succinct way, it's a work in progress. We haven't achieved that yet, but that's one of the fundamental goals of the group that we're participating in. And I think an important one for a variety of reasons. One is because we do want to have something that's measurable, that's meaningful, but also because there's a recognition, I think, within that working group that these are not, DCF kids, they're not EEC kids, they're the Commonwealth's kids, but in a lot of ways our systems and our work up to this point in time haven't always best reflected that as a practice. And I think we're really endeavoring to try to ensure that is the practice, and it's the practice across the board for all agencies, and that we're maximizing the leverage points that each agency has.
And within that, will there be some EEC specific goals as we think about what it is that we're really aiming to do as we think about all of the systems that are currently in motion?
There may be. I don't know if ultimately we've landed in a spot where the goals that we establish for the group, are applicable to every single agency equally, or it's possible that there may be identified goals for all agencies, but there's a subset of goals that are important, because our responsibilities, while they are all of our children, our responsibilities do differ, and we each have different roles, so it may bear out that there's going to be some uniqueness to some of the goals. I think my answer to the question is that we're going to maintain flexibility for that as a possibility. I can't tell you today that there's going to be that distinction, but it's possible that may exist in the end.
It does feel to me like in the next couple of years, there will be opportunity to do some workforce support and then track through the new data system, whether in fact that has any effect in concrete data, such as the health and safety, right? So which is where we ultimately want to get to, looking closely at the relationship between learning opportunities for the workforce and what we see in patterns and trends in the data, which would allow for setting some kind of benchmark criteria, like what is out of range? And when do we have too much of a trend downward in some sites, and only through the data, and then trying to connect intentional workforce supports the data when we get there. But I think that it's gonna be a critical move, right? To start to bring more sort of modeling to this work. Dave, you had a.
Yeah, this kind of on-the-ground monitoring is, very labor-intensive. Do you feel you have or can deploy staff within the department to get this work done? It's not that easy.
So I think we've tried to start a process of building up more staff capacity, Dave. It's an excellent question, and I appreciate it. We may very well need additional staff. And we, presently, are carrying caseload ratios for our staff, which are beyond what their recommended benchmarks are across all categories of licensing. We have this year been able to bring on, across the agency, 21 additional staff, which is a significant increase year over year. I think we're going to have to continue, and this would actually apply to the point that the chair made as well regarding the data. This is new work, and we've anticipated some of what the new demands are going to be with some of these additional staff hires, but I think we're going to have to maintain vigilance and openness to the fact that there may be additional resources that are needed beyond even those that we're bringing on board this year. However, I would say it will help us when we get deeper into the work to know more precisely what those needs are going to be, and therefore what those asks from the agency to the board, and then from the board to those policymakers and budget writers that ultimately influence our resources. We're gonna benefit from the experience as we get a little deeper into this. We have brought on, specific to this work around group homes, I think, which is relevant and it's picked up in a future slide, is we have hired 2 additional RMP licenses this year. We've hired 5 additional investigators, which might not intuitively seem like it is a big response to this piece, but because of the nature of the work that takes place within these residential programmings, the vulnerability of that population, the 24/7 aspect of it, those are where we often find the most difficult and challenging issues and noncompliances and matters that need intensive review by this agency. And so doubling our investigation workforce is important to support that work. Also, it shifts some of the burden of investigations which had fallen on our RMP licensors onto investigators as well. So that's some of the resources that we're bringing into play with respect to the work now. But we're going to have to continue to monitor this, because unannounced visits will generate a substantially higher percentage of non-compliances than announced visits. There's no dress rehearsal any longer in this environment. So we're expecting, and this is part of what I think we're going to have to do as we assess the data, to your point, Madam Chair, is look at that data and really think about what we're establishing by way of a benchmark, because the data next year is going to be very different than the data this year with the introduction of unannounced visits. So we're going to have to assess that and establish what our goals are, in part on the basis of what that experience is within the first year especially.
Thank you.
I think it's a fact that, that there have been unannounced visits, and announced visits, I should say, and there were still these problems in these homes, speaks to the fact that, workforce training is really necessary. People must not have known, if they knew somebody was coming out, that these issues were a problem. So I do think it speaks to the need for training and support in that area.
Eleonora, then Joan, then Joni.
I don't mean to sound simplistic with this question, but I really think that it goes to something that you just mentioned. Do we know what is causing the fact that they are not complying? And what I mean by that is, do we have the policies that are necessary? Are those policies known? And by who and how? And also, because that would imply the kind of workforce training varies depending on what is the cause of the issue. The fact that there are more non-compliance in unannounced visits says, okay, so they probably do know, but they don't realize how important they are, which is a different kind of training to they don't know. So we need to make it known. See what I'm trying to say? What kind of data do we have to try to understand why the non-compliance? And how much of the confusion might be that they are responding to two very different agencies, which may have two very different sets of policies, so they think that they're compliant, but actually they're not. Do we know any of that?
So I would answer, there's a lot within the point that you just made, Eleonora. Thank you. I would say that I think we know what our present level of data tells us, which is, I don't think adequate to the task, which is why we acknowledge the need to develop a system, to give us better data capability. We also acknowledge that this is a private system. While it's receiving state funding, these are entities that are not, they're not state agencies, they're not divisions of state agencies, which is why this effort to do outreach through MAPS and to engage them in the conversation, I think is highly relevant and necessary in order for us to move the ball, because it ultimately is about what's happening, not just the day that EEC shows up or DCF shows up, but what's more importantly happening for the many, many days, weeks, and months in between, which is what we're obviously encountering when we show up for an unannounced visit, is the residue of that. So, I think we're aware that there are opportunities, and in some cases, there are holes and gaps within the system that we're trying together to work to resolve. I don't, and this will be part of the conversation with the provider community. I don't have an answer for you with respect to whether or not the existence of multiple agencies, and it's not always just two, by the way, it's some cases more than even just two, is a factor that they're trying to satisfy, two different sets of interests. There's already a degree of alignment within the work that HHS's agencies are doing and our agencies are doing, so it shouldn't frankly prove to be a distraction for these programs, but we're gonna wanna hear more from them as to whether or not their experience might suggest otherwise. And if that's the case, then we'll figure out ways that we might be able to address that.
Thank you.
I think the disturbing thing about the situation is that they are the most vulnerable children in the Commonwealth. Right? That's just true across the board. We see it all the time, and it worries them.
And all the normal checks that we rely on, right? I mean, we rely on a marketplace, we rely on parents, many of whom will make reports, and in the absence of any of those safeguards, the state's role is even more important. And, part of what I think really struck me is that in all the time I've spent on the board, we've very rarely had an opportunity to talk about residential placement, and when we do, it's often focused on a specific program or a very discrete issue. And this, I think, does kind of raise, in my mind, the fact that we have not done as good a job of really thinking about this very vulnerable population and the needs specific to this segment of the field that we serve. And so, in addition to a lot of the new sort of technical systems that are coming on board, we're also at this kind of unique juncture where we have regulations wide open. We have a workforce development system wide open. We have, changes in staffing that are occurring and a new leadership team in place. And so we might be at a juncture where we might all really benefit from deeper conversations with MAP and others who really have expertise that very few of us, frankly, have about working in this setting. In order to really think about, can we look at the work that's currently happening through the lens of residential placement and what might be needed in order to better support services on the ground, the settings that kids are growing up in. Definitely workforce training is an excellent, excellent place to start. There may be other things as well. And, you know, I think from the board perspective and maybe also from the agency perspective, how do we think about ensuring that this is not only a sort of marginal and tangential thing that we touch on only when crises are brought to our attention, but really something that becomes more regularly part of operations?
So I appreciate that point. There are a couple of things I want to note that actually are issues that the board, perhaps maybe not even in full knowledge, has worked on in recent years that touch on this, and things that the agency has really intentionally done to make sure that the RMP work is put on the same level as all of our other work. One of which is, as I know, the hiring processes have tried to really slant towards this work, because I think it's one in which we felt that there was acute need. But I think from a policy and practice standpoint, that might not have been easily discernible, is that one, the requirement for the federal government for annual unannounced visits does not apply to residential programs because they're not CCDF funded. So we, as an agency, however, felt that the practice was important enough that we wanted to undertake it as a state prerogative, not as a federal prerogative. So we designed our processes and we've initiated it in a way to ensure that unannounced visits are happening, not out of a response to a federal mandate, but because we think it's really, really important, particularly within those settings. So I just want to note that that piece is there. Similarly, within the background record check process, as we recently put out and the board approved for public comment, the BRC standard that in some cases does match the federal requirement, again, did not have to apply to those in residential programs because those programs are not CCDF funded. However, again, we felt that it was important that we apply an equally high standard and get the benefits of that standard by ensuring that those programs are included within the proposed regulations. Now, we might hear feedback, you know, during the public process around that. I don't know if we will or will not. But I just wanted to, you know, make sure that it was of note, because as the agency has considered these issues, we really have been intentional trying to attend to the RMP work, because as I noted earlier in my comments, the licensors, you know, have been really, really diligent and dedicated and dutifully have reported to us, you know, what they're seeing, and we've tried to be responsive to that. So we're certainly not making any case that the picture as it stands, or even the picture as we can envision it, because some of the things that we're working on are coming to fruition over the next year, is complete or final. But it's, I think, important progress, and I think recognizes, you know, that we've had this in our sights.
Joni and then Mary, and then I'll ask the commissioner if I want to finish the presentation.
It's interesting to listen to everybody's comments because I really think we're feeding on each other. And Tom, what you just said in terms of these programs not under the purview of CCDF, I really appreciate, because I often say, but remember those other programs that we don't cover. So I'm all for supporting our programs. Also, to underscore what Joan and a few other folks had said, when we talk about workforce, we obviously need to think about our limited resources that we have here. And you brought up the notion of leadership and really looking at leadership, and I think that's something that the workforce group is looking at in terms of professional development, and I'm wondering how many things we can put into a bucket so that we can utilize our resources the best way. And leadership always seems to be coming up. So I think that this has raised a number of points, because we want to attack it from many different angles, but be as consistent as possible.
Thank you.
I want to be careful with this comment, but I feel there's a terrible need to say it. First and foremost, I agree completely with Sheila that this is a very vulnerable population, and if there's any population that I think tugs at all of our hearts, it's children who have been removed from their homes where they, you know, have identified as the place where they're most loved. Unfortunately, maybe that's not the case, which is why some of them have been removed. That, and so I don't in any way want this comment to sound as if I think that they don't deserve the absolute A+ quality. But I also spent 18 years of my life running group homes prior to my movement to this world of the foundation, which was a very privileged move. And I just want to acknowledge that it's not just the professional development. It's also under-resourced to get repairs done. It's under-resourced to replace furniture that gets a whole lot of use and abuse, and probably could be replaced every 6 months. Or, you know, it's kids who are challenged, it's kids who, you know, are trying their best to cope, but, you know, can be really difficult to work with. And I just want to acknowledge that in no way excuses, certainly this records check, you know, that's just gotta happen. That's, you know, the physical issues are just, they're nonstop, and I think we just need to acknowledge yes, it's professional development, but it's also whether they're resourced, the agencies that are being contracted to work with these important young people, have huge burdens of trying to stay on top of all of this stuff. And so I just felt the need to sort of add that to the mix. And again, not to say that we should not accept and expect the best, but we also need to advocate for the other things that these organizations need in order to accomplish this, so.
Mary, just to build off that, given my own work in group homes and early in my career, you know, the other thing that struck me in this OIG report is that there's nothing about the quality of the interactions or the practice itself, right? So what we also don't want to do is jump to the idea that the disrepaired furniture equals a lousy climate for those children, right? And so that was the other piece in all of this work that you do, is this is a segment of the portfolio that hasn't yet shifted to some of this process measurement, which is like, what are the quality of the interactions? What should we be looking for? And so we don't necessarily want to be drawing straight lines between the physical space. Records check, absolutely, couldn't agree with Mary more, but the physical space, we certainly want it in good shape, but we don't want to make the leap from the upkeep to the quality of the care necessarily.
I know you wanted to finish, but back to the root cause analysis, right? I mean, I think we're all saying the same thing, right? That you can't assume, right? We have logical consequences or logical assumptions, I think. But if, let's just say ideally, the furniture is in disrepair because they spend all of their time outside exercising and they're hardly ever in their rooms. Granted, that might be wishful thinking, but if that ends up being part of the problem, it sort of changes the solution. Or if it's because the furniture that is purchased is, they have to have within their budget is the lowest quality, and so, you know, anyone who's over 200 pounds, whatever it is. But I think that's what we're all getting at, is understanding in a formal way what is actually behind this, because I think workforce development is probably or possibly not the only thing.
Appreciate it. No, I appreciate all of these points. I do. And I hope you take some measure of comfort from the fact that I think that they mirror the conversations that we're having across the agencies, in that we have you know, mechanisms and forms in place that are trying to further those conversations into meaningful changes in policy and practice and just higher levels of coordination. I certainly wouldn't want it to have been conveyed that I think workforce is it. I was simply one example of something beyond what we're doing in response to the OIG audit recommendations. I think my larger point there is simply to say that while we appreciate the OIG's recommendations, and they touch upon some important elements of system improvements that we could make, it's not sufficient from our own vantage point, and that there are other areas that we've identified as priorities as well that we think are necessary to complement these pieces, in that we're moving ahead, you know, with those pieces, and we'll continue to move ahead with those components as well. So, if I may, jump to, we're okay. Just this piece here, I'm not going to belabor this. I've already picked it up in the narrative, but this is just to point out the timeline for two of the relevant systems that we're developing in response to this, and to indicate that, you know, these have both been issues that we've been working on for multiple years and are now either yielding or in part yielding some of the benefits that we had hoped to achieve in that, or will have reached full implementation over the course of the upcoming year, specifically in terms of our unannounced visit delivery, as well as in terms of having a system that will finally support the 2013 state law, as well as the CCDBG requirements that we've presently been challenged to meet with the existing systems. So the final slide that I mentioned, and again, some of these things have been brought up already, is that we've undertaken other efforts in the course of recent years to address some of these issues. We've identified that we have needs within EEC and have started to address some of those needs in terms of personnel with some relevant hiring up and capacity building. We've also engaged in a significant level of additional interagency coordination with bi-monthly meetings with EEC and DCF to discuss and work on oversight of foster care group homes. The EEC RMP licensors and supervisors are meeting regularly with Caring Together representatives to discuss issues within those facilities and to try to work on improving and resolving any issues that are identified there. We've been participating now for the past 2 years in a working group led by the OCA, involving the other parties that I previously mentioned, which is intended to look at group homes in this work and undertake comprehensive statewide systemic reforms. In that we're going to be working closely with the OCA and DESE in particular, along with MAPS, the Association for Approved Private Schools, to look at training and professional development needs and opportunities. And we think that's going to be an important, meaningful engagement there as well. And then I've noted here that we can have a discussion. We probably have had some discussion, but there's still room for further discussion if anybody has any questions or comments. I'd welcome them.
The only thing I'll say is, just kind of speaking on behalf of DCF, is the relationship with EEC is critical, and DCF also has staff that go out and do unannounced visits, paying attention to the care of the kids, but also the environment, and will communicate back if they see something, so the burden's not all on EEC, and make sure they're the only eyes out there doing this. And the other group, as we sit here talking now, that we should tap into is the Children's League, because those providers were, when their report came out too, they were all wanting to know, was this my program, what were my findings and all of that, so they're definitely on board with us, so we should tap into that.
Great.
Great.
Thank you, Pat. Great. Any further questions or comments?
Thank you,
Oh, thank
Commissioner,
you.
for this.
I appreciate the
And,
opportunity. Thank you,
It just
Carmel
strikes me
and
that
Felicia.
we may want to just think about having an agenda item at our summer retreat on residential and placement to kind of revisit this piece of the portfolio. To your point, Joan, it's not always front and center for all kinds of reasons, but it's certainly worth committing to an ongoing conversation about. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, appreciate it, thank you.
So we'll move now to our second item on the proposed subsidy regulation changes.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Lasso, Secretary Pizer, Commissioner Weber, board members and members of the public. Thank you for allowing us to speak here today. I am Tom Myers, I'm an attorney here with the agency. And I'm joined by Carol Meehan, who's the Director of CASO and Financial Assistance. And today we will be walking you through the proposed changes to the subsidy regulations. Hope to have a discussion on this today, similar to what we've done in the past with other regulations, have a discussion, and then ultimately present at a future date to initiate a public comment period. So So first, I just want to get into a brief overview and just talk about who does EEC actually serve as far as the subsidy population. So EEC provides subsidies to eligible families seeking care at early education care or on school time programs, and they generally must meet income and activity requirements. Now, the populations include the income eligible recipients, and as of November of 2017, this was about a little over 32,300 children that EEC was serving. Now, these families must enter EEC's subsidy system through its wait list. They must meet income and service need requirements, which are set out by EEC's regulations, and these are authorized by Child Care Resource Referral Agencies, CCR&Rs, or contracted providers. The second population that we serve is the supportive child care, which is through the Department of Children and Families, or DCF. And as of November 2017, this was just under 8,000 children that EEC was serving. Now, under supportive child care, that is immediate access to child care, which is considered an entitlement when it's authorized per our line item language. This would be authorized by DCF staff, these children. The other population that we serve is transitional aid to families with dependent children, TFDC recipients. And as of November of 2017, this was a little over 11,300 children that EEC was serving. Now, TFDC also has immediate access to childcare as long as they are receiving TAFDC benefits and authorized by the Department of Transitional Assistance. Now, individuals under Department of Transitional Assistance also will receive child care in a transitional period. So these are individuals whose cash case is closed and they're working and they meet EEC's income eligible requirements. So they could be entitled for an additional year of child care. And then there's also the post-transitional recipients. These are individuals who meet EEC's income eligible requirements. They can get an additional 1 year after the transitional period. Now, this is also an entitlement in Massachusetts under our line item language. Now, the recipients under TFDC must comply with, all of these individuals must comply with mandates under CCDBG or the Child Care Development Block Grant. And then just to go into briefly to summarize the EEC's current subsidy requirements, one being that there must be Massachusetts residency. The other is verification of eligibility of countable household members. For example, this is your biological or adoptive parents, step-parents, dependent relatives, dependent children. So then we would go into an income requirement. Now, the gross household income must be at or below 50% of the state median income at the initial assessment, and it may not exceed 85% of the SMI at any reassessment. Now, families seeking child care may also have an asset requirement, so they can't have any more than $1 million in assets. Now, this is actually a requirement that is new under CCDBG, but EEC had actually implemented this before the requirement came out, so we had this in place. Now, income requirements are waived for individuals seeking care under both DCF and TAFDC. This is just for people receiving the cash benefit. It excludes the transitional and post-transitional requirement. Now, as far as the activity requirements, right now the acceptable activity requirements are employment, participating in education or training, or receiving or at risk of receiving protective services. So this may include families authorized under through DCF will be deemed in need of protective services, and this includes foster care, and there are some other special circumstances that may qualify for protective services. So to get into what are the benefits of the new regulations, so with these new regulations, we hope to deliver a more stable and continuous child care, financial assistance to families by extending their eligibility for child care to a minimum of 12 months for more children. This, along with decreased reporting requirements during the 12-month period and a more streamlined absence policy, we think will significantly reduce the burden on families, the subsidy administrators, so this would include the CCR&Rs and contracted providers, as well as EEC. We also see a benefit of increased flexibility for EEC to better serve priority populations, and this is with the more expansive definition of homelessness under McKinney-Vento, which is actually required under CCDBG.
Could I ask just a question in
Sure.
connection with that? It's come up a lot for us in Lawrence because we have so many teen mothers that if the father of the child of a teen mother is on the birth certificate, they have to comply with the father has to comply with all the regulations. Very often the teen mother has no connection whatsoever with the father, and so she's being denied childcare to be in high school. I know this is a very, complicated thing, but I just wondered if you could think about that. Is there any flexibility for us to waive consideration of a father on a birth certificate for a teen mother at some point? And I don't expect you to answer now, but I promised I would put it on the agenda for today.
Certainly good. That's
Okay, thank you.
Cheryl. So another benefit under the new regulations is a development of a more formalized system to maintain program integrity, to limit improper payments and other fraudulent activities. So EEC will ensure that there are processes in place to both investigate and recover fraudulent payments and to pose any sanctions on clients or providers in response to fraud. And then lastly, a benefit is ensuring compliance with the mandates under the Child Care Development Block Grant. So why is EEC actually revising its subsidy regulations now? So as you may know, EEC receives a majority of its funding from the Child Care Development Block Grant, or CCDBG, and this is the federal law that authorizes the regulations set forth in the Child Care Development Fund, or CCDF. So CCDF is the primary funding source providing child care development on families. Now, in September of 2014, CCDF was reauthorized, which made significant changes to how child care was administered throughout the states. So these were designed to strengthen requirements to protect the health and safety of children, to help parents make informed consumer choices, provide equal access to stable, high-quality child care, and also to enhance the quality of child care in the early childhood workforce. Now, CCDBG requires that these new regulations for the states become effective September 30th of 2018. So that is the deadline to get everything implemented. Now, just to note that subsidy regulations here at EEC are governed under both state and federal law. They were last revised in January of 2013. So just to note that under state law, that authorizes the EEC board to both consolidate and coordinate resources for public funding streams for early education and care. And then we have the Child Care Development Fund, which is the federal regulation. Now, I'd just like to note that under CCDBG, the regulations have a broad mandate that allows, in those requirements, it allows states the discretion in how they interpret those broad mandates in each CCDB requirement. So I'll go into just a brief timeline for the regulation revision. So as we are presenting the proposed regulations today for the board, and then moving forward in the winter and spring, we intend to come back to this board to present the regulations again to initiate the public comment period. After that, we would likely hold several public hearings throughout the Commonwealth, and then ultimately present the final draft regulations before the board to promulgate. Now, what we were planning was to file the proposed final draft regulations with the Secretary of State on June 8th of 2018, which would allow the regulations to become effective on June 22nd, 2018. The reason for this delay is that we want to coordinate these regulations with some changes that we're making to our Child Care Financial Assistance System, CCFA. So we want to coordinate and sync those up so that we release them at the same time. And then just to go into a summary of some stakeholder engagement that we've engaged in. So in October of 2017, we met with a representative of the Department of Housing and Community Development, or DHCD, to discuss the proposed changes. We went over the revisions to the homelessness requirements, so moving to the expansive McKinney-Vento definition, and also moving towards having homelessness as a qualified service need. So we did receive positive feedback from DHCD. In October of 2017, we also presented these proposed regulations to our monthly advisory council meeting, which that council has several members from the provider community, so we presented those regulations to them. October and December of 2017, we also presented the proposed changes to our monthly board ad hoc meeting. And then in November, in December of 2017, we shared our regulations both with the Department of Children and Families and the Department of Transitional Assistance and received feedback, and we're able to incorporate some of their feedback into our changes. We also met with the Department of Transitional Assistance several times to go over some issues there as well and received their feedback and incorporated that into our changes. Lastly, in December of 2017, we shared our proposed regulations with the Attorney General's Office and got some feedback from them and incorporated some of their changes into our proposed regulations as well. So just to go into the key CCDBG requirements, so basically these are some of the mandates required under CCDBG, and we broke them down into, essentially grouped them into four major categories, so 4 objectives. So the first one is a focus on child stability. So under this category, some of the major changes would include an implementation of at least 12-month authorization for childcare for more eligible children. It also requires a mandatory unlimited 12-week job search if the lead agency chooses to terminate the child care during the 12-month authorization. There's no terminations for temporary changes in certain circumstances, and they also require that there's no increase to the parent co-payment within the period of the 12-month authorization. Lastly, within this, the CCDBG recommends delinking provider payments from the eligible child's occasional absences. So essentially, this is, so a provider is not precluded from receiving payment for occasional absences of the child. The next objective under CCDBG would be to ease the burden on the parents. So under this, the mandates required by CCDBG would be to have the department pay for each program's mandatory registration fees, and this is including annual registration fee, which may be capped and considered reasonable. EEC must also update its sliding fee scale to accommodate with the recommended benchmark under CCDBG, which is to have the parent fee be no more than 7% of the parent's total income. Now, under this, there's mandates that EEC also require that the CCR&Rs and programs have parent-friendly practices for communication, including limited mandatory reporting requirements. Now, the next major objective would be to prioritize special populations. So this would be to prioritize children with special needs, experiencing homelessness and very low income, and then to utilize the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness. And then the last is to maintain program integrity. So this would be to require parent notifications during the 12-month authorization that impact the family's eligibility. This would include any income that exceeds 85% of the SMI, where there's a non-temporary change in that parent's circumstances, or those that enable lead agency to contact the family. So under CCDBG, they essentially allow the states the discretion to define what a non-temporary change will actually is, and allows them the discretion to go through that. So EEC must have the process in place also to identify fraud and other program violations and to impose sanctions on providers in response to fraud. So next on this slide, I know there's a lot of color here, so I'll kind of walk you through here. So we're going to walk through some of the proposed changes to both regulation and policy. So in the left-hand column, we have the topic area that we're going to discuss, and we have noted whether that is a required area under CCDBG, whether it's a recommended area, or whether it's something that EEC will be taking completely independent of CCDBG. In the next column, there will be the changes that we're going forward with. So the regulation changes will be in red, the policy changes will be in green, and then we also have asterisks that will denote whether the change is a discretionary change under CCDBG or whether this is a change that is implemented outside of CCDBG. So something that EEC decided to move forward with that's not required in the final rule. So first, sure.
Can I just ask a quick question about this notion of an approved educational agency? Can you just say more about that, Jean?
Sure. So one of the things that we found recently is our current definition is any technical assistance or training program that leads to employment, but that can be practically anything in the system. So we're finding there's a lot of programs that are essentially assisted job search, but that could appear as training. So I think we're looking to kind of tighten it up. So we would have to define approved, but we would want to make sure we're covering all vocational and technical schools, all accredited universities or high schools, any GED programs, things like that. But just to kind of make sure we have a little bit of a tighter definition for what qualifies as training.
I see, so, and what about the administrative burden of monitoring that on an ongoing basis? Is the cost benefit there, in other words, I guess, you feel?
I think, I'll speak to that. We're actually trying to mitigate against that with a clearer definition. So right now, the burden on us is that there's such vagueness around what we're using by way of criteria, and this is an opportunity for us to address that with, and it's not necessarily the goal is to be more restrictive, just more clear about what qualifies and what doesn't qualify. So in that regard, we actually think it would be administratively beneficial because it will provide greater clarity, both in terms of the approval, in terms of the authorization, but also in terms of, and this is a natural part of the work, is that there are appeals and challenges, and the clarity of that definition will also mitigate against some of the work associated with that.
Can I just give a heads up to our newest board member, David Cruz, whose work is definitely related to these organizations and that are providing technical training and education, correct, David? And maybe you can be a resource to the department as we, because it is a myriad of different sort of opportunities, and I know, David, it's a space that you've spent a lot of time in.
Great. Thank you.
Or I just threw you under the bus.
No, I understand.
So under the proposed new regulations, as far as the qualified service needs, the employment will remain the same. The enrollment at the educational and vocational agency, the change there is the approved. So we'll add that language in there. We'd also probably define in policy what some of those improved programs will actually be. So maybe we can work with Dave and get an idea of what some of those programs would be as far as defined in policy. The next qualified service need is the enrollment in accredited high school equivalency program. So this is going to remain the same, except that we're going to limit it to 1 year. From our experience, a lot of these programs can be completed within 1 year, so we have that's the 1 year cap on that.
Can I ask the rationale for limiting it to 1 year?
For the equivalency programs, you mean? Yeah, from our experience, a lot of these programs could be completed within the 1 year, so we would limit it to just the 1 year on it.
I think the other mindset is that also, since we're giving more generous childcare benefits, that we had to look very closely at what service needs qualified. When we started doing research, it looked like most of the programs were be completed in far less than 1 year, so we felt the 1 year would be appropriate. I think we've always looked at it that we could extend it by variance if there was a particular circumstance, but just when we were trying to tighten up some of our qualified service needs, that was something we had looked into.
I'm just curious because I work in an adult learning center, and very often the students in the program need much more than 1 year because of their other extended responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a combined service, I think that's their only service need. So they're not also working or in any sort of other training, that their only service need is that they're in this program. Versus as someone who's both working and in this, then that would be a combined, which would be a little bit different.
Thank you. Thanks.
So another qualified service need that EEC currently offers is a special need of parents. This is a parent that's suffering from some sort of disability. The change here would be to limit it to a case-by-case basis, so essentially a review under our variance policy. And then we'd be adding another qualified service need, which would be the homelessness service need. Now, we'd be limiting this to 1 year, but we'd also have the ability to extend this beyond 1 year under our variance policy. And the idea is that it's going to be more expansive. Under the more expansive definition of a community-vento, we see an increase in people utilizing this service need. So we just want to maintain some oversight on that, where we would give it for a year and then be able to review that after the year. The next topic here is the initial job search period, and this is something that's recommended by CCDBG, is not necessarily required. Currently, EEC does have a policy that allows for initial job search. So this is someone that comes into the program that doesn't have a qualified service need. EEC will actually allow for 8 weeks of job search with a possible 4-week extension. So under the new regulations and consistent with CCDBG, we will give 12 weeks of job search as far as going forward to allow them to come in and find a qualified service need. And then the next, going on to homelessness, again, this would be something that we'll be using as a qualified service need. So under current policy, EEC allows families referred by DHCD or DCF under the homeless contract to use a homelessness as a service need in lieu of employment or education or training. So we'll continue to allow homeless families to utilize this status in lieu of a service need, and we will, all applicable income and will still be counted towards the parent's vehicle as applied. So again, we will use the McKinney-Vento definition of homelessness under that.
So a couple of questions. I don't know if you have the answers to them yet. Under the expanded definition of homelessness, do we have an estimate of how many more children might be able to establish eligibility under homelessness than has been happening in the past?
We don't have solid numbers on that. I think a lot, even with my past work here, certainly so with DHCD, it's sometimes hard to identify that doubled up population that qualifies. We are planning on conversations with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education to try to build upon what they do already in the public schools for certifying against McKinney-Vento to kind of model, and to even in certain circumstances if there's a school-age child in the home using their certification. But we don't have clear numbers on what this will mean for our population, particularly for those that have only children under the age of 5 that aren't currently being tracked under this.
And are we looking at treating homelessness as automatic eligibility?
So that I think is something we're more addressing in the contract side. So this just establishes that this service need can be used across all of our programs. So even if someone who's just been on the wait list who gets a funding letter but doesn't have a job at this particular time, or a family that's in our system that has a crisis and that becomes homeless, all of those will be able to use this service need rather than just those in the homeless contract. And then we're kind of looking at the immediate access piece as part of more the contract bid, once we have this regulatory kind of standard in place to help them.
So I know there's a lot, there's obviously in flux still. Do we have even a ballpark sense of how we think this expansion might impact general income eligibility and access to the system?
Not in specific terms.
Okay.
I have to say, my day-to-day work, I work a lot with this population. It's a very slippery number.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I guess what part of what I'm thinking about as we look at all of the different regulations is how do we ensure that the income eligibility gateway doesn't become so constrained that it's almost impossible for a parent who doesn't have another established service need to come in. That's what I'm thinking of.
When we get a little further along and we talk about next steps, a big part of it is doing our best with data, in some cases adequate, in some cases we're going to be bootstrapping with the data that we have to generate cost estimates that would inform impact statements. When I say cost estimates, ultimately, to your point, there's a finite resource available here, and historically, income eligible has absorbed some of the impacts of changes made in other program areas. I think that's the inference that I'm deriving from your question. Those are the kinds of questions that we're looking to address within our impact analysis, so that when we bring back to a final set of draft standards, we might be in a better position to answer those impacts and speak to why where we landed, the regulation, the policy is still consistent with CCDBG, which it must be, but also might better inform an answer to a question like the one that you just asked.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to the next topic. So a bit more detail on the special need of parent. So again, this isn't something that's addressed specifically in CCDBG, so this would be an EEC change that we're doing. Now, under CCDBG, it gives the flexibility to define what is included in the protected services. So right now, EEC's definition of protected services does include families that are unable to provide childcare for any portion of their day due to physical, mental, or emotional, or medical condition. So the change here, again, is going to be that EEC will no longer use this as a service need that can be approved by subsidy administrators in the field. Instead, we'll be pulling this in-house and we'll be evaluating all of these on a variance process on a year-to-year basis. So there's also going to be a limit to be limited to 2 years. So anyone that utilizes this service need will have a 2-year cap on how long they can use that, and that will be again reviewed on a case-by-case basis for any extension.
And is that irrespective of the number of kids they have, or how do you factor in the number of children to that 2-year? Is there any relationship there?
So often just based on how we've, the 2-year limit was established in regulations in 2013, so we started the variance to extend beyond 2 years a few years ago. What we find is largely we look at a lot of times the age of the children, the nature of the disability. For example, we might treat a case differently if it's a child under the age of 5 who needs, or even a 2-year-old or an infant that needs care all day versus a school-age child who is in school most of the day. And so we kind of look at each individual circumstance to see if in that particular case it warrants additional years of care.
And are you using protocols or something, rubrics, to kind of do this sort of case-by-case analysis?
Yeah, I mean, we have a set form and information that we request both from the parent and from a medical professional that speaks to the specific nature of the disability and whether or not, what assistance the parent needs during the day.
So it's possible that some folks have better advocates than others in terms of those letters and such?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Can I ask you a question? This actually came up last week for me, where a parent gave me this, well, I couldn't find the form on the web.
Yeah.
That was very hard to find. I called Kathleen. She knew But my questions are sort of, for this case, it was the fact, it was for a 2-year-old who has an older sibling with severe autism.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's sort of not, it's hard to be saved for, even though he's in school.
Yeah.
Et cetera. So mom said she was told to use this and see if it would get approved. So I don't know if you've seen that one.
I've heard about it.
You have, that's
Yes.
fine. She, and an advocate advised her to do that. So I guess what I'm wondering is, what are the most common scenarios that you do approve? Because there's, again, sort of it's a, what are the parent challenges that require daycare, but you can do it at night and on weekends?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, I would have to say sometimes the easiest ones to approve are sometimes the more temporary conditions. One that we were working on this week was a mother who was recently diagnosed with cancer and has to undergo cancer treatments. She obviously cannot do that and take care of her young child. But she has friends and neighbors helping her on the nights and the weekends. Or, we talk about if a parent gets into a car accident and has a back injury and can't lift their young child. Versus an older child that can feed and clothe themselves. So that's some of the easier ones are the physical. The more difficult ones that we have are the mental illnesses, and evaluating those, and those definitely become a lot more difficult and a lot less clear cut as to what can. A lot of times we do ask those questions if we don't have the information in the letter of who is assisting at night and on the weekends with your care outside of this, because sometimes it's a very fine line sometimes between that we may need to file a 51A on this parent versus, and we have to remind some of these medical professionals that they are mandated reporters in some of these things.
I think that it's a fine line, right? Because a lot of parents who do have medical or mental health or other issues, like my patient, we don't want to discourage them because it is actually in the best interest of that child to be in a structured, safe setting for socialization for as much as possible for them to be primed to be successful in kindergarten. Right, so it's a very fine line.
But we also have to deal with, again, the finite resources and the intent of this program as more of a support for people that have a service need. So it's that constant balancing point that we have in evaluating this.
So, I understand all this. This just seems like a ripe topic for interagency work, and I'm wondering, are the program folks involved in some of this? Because some of these cases, resources could be provided outside of your office, and I'm wondering, are the EEC staff involved in this? Because I could see, and I do this daily, what other resources might the family use in the interim?
So I definitely think that's something we could do more of, and that we'll have to look into increasing our use of that.
The piece I'd add, if I may, Joni, as well, is, so in terms of establishing criteria, you're spot on. I think there's a real opportunity for us to collaborate with sister agencies that I think can help us inform.
Even in our agency, yeah.
Sister agencies, I wasn't referring to the folks within our agency, but yes, to your point, there's, for two purposes. One is to look at how we land in an appropriate place to try to create guidelines for this particular area. The other piece is programmatic, to your point, which I had not thought about, and I think it's good that you're raising it about what other options might in fact be there. Carol hit the nail on the head in saying that the short-term situations are easier for us to manage and consider than longer-term ones, and that's the piece that we're still trying to size up as far as where we want to land them in the draft regulations before they bring them to you. As you can tell from this conversation, we're open to any other further suggestions about what we might use to create the right set of criteria and any other ideas that folks have about how we can address this issue. Carol raised the 2-year limit that was placed on in 2013. It had been open-ended prior to that. This has been a really difficult area for the agency to manage because it's not terribly well bounded, and as a result of that, we've had some circumstances that have gone on for well over 10 years in some cases, and so we're trying to figure out a way to create consistency, and we welcome any inputs that folks have about things that we might want to consider.
So I know, Carol, you mentioned that not wanting to file a 51A, so we would kind of support you in that.
Yeah.
But I also think if somebody with a mental illness, somebody with developmental delays, if Human Services or our agencies can help with some of the determinations or helping to get them more actively engaged, please let us know and we can work the process out.
Absolutely.
So the next topic under CSA that we're proposing to change is the parent reporting requirements during the 12 months, and this is something that is required under CCDBG. So the rule states that we want to limit the amount of notifications that parents are required to report, but they do require them to report any increases in total household income that exceeds the 85% SMI. The rule also requires parents report any change of address that will move them out of state. Both of these will make the family ineligible. The last thing that they allow parents parents to notify is non-temporary changes, and they actually allow the state to define what exactly constitutes a non-temporary change. So in our definition, we include the income increases totaling 85% of 85 SMI, changes in household composition that will last for more than 30 days within a 12-month authorization period. So this will include anyone moving in and out of the house, changes in child custody arrangements, and then any cessation of parents' work, training, or education that will last for more than 30 days. So if they lose a job or their training program and expect to last more than 30 days, they would be required to report that. The next topic is the reassessment after the 12-month period. So this isn't specifically addressed under CCDBG, other than to require that states issue a full 12-month authorization for eligible children. So right now, EEC is in the process of assessing some policies about how we're going to evaluate these families at the reassessment period. Due to the decreased notification requirements, we want to make sure that everything is covered. So we're assessing those policies right now. Under the final rule, EEC does have the authority to establish conditions or priority rules in addition to those specified in the final rule, as long as they do not discriminate or limit parental rights or impact eligibility other than at the time of assessment or reassessment. So the next topic that we will get into is the absences requirement. So this is something that is required under CCDBG, and they expect that states pay for a percentage of explained absences with a benchmark of 85% attendance for the child. They also allow the states to essentially only terminate for absences if it's excessive unexplained absences. They don't want states to terminate for excessive explained absences. So what EEC will do as far as a proposed change, EEC will define excessive absences as more than 3 consecutive non-attended days, so this would be a no-show, no-call, or more than 45 non-attended days in a 12-month authorization period. So if we have a situation where it's the unexplained absences, the 3 consecutive no-show, no-call, EEC could terminate for those absences. However, if a family has more than 45 absences within a 12-month period, EEC will not terminate the subsidy for the child. Instead, the provider may bill the parent directly at the state subsidized rate for any absences beyond 45 days.
Can the provider terminate them for non-payment?
Right, so the provider.
It's up to them.
Yeah, it'll be up to the provider, so we will put in the provider may terminate for excessive absences.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, failure of a parent to pay any attendance fees is also, it can be a grounds for a termination of the subsidy. Now, something that we'll be implementing in policy is additional notification requirements to the parents. So this will include notifications to the parents following the 30th, the 35th, and the 40th absences. We also plan to initiate or install an approved break in care. So if the child does plan on being out for an extended period of time, we will require that that child be put on an extended break in care. And then lastly, there will be an exemption process that will spell out in policy for children that have a qualifying severe chronic illness, and that may require many absences within a 12-month period. So the next topic area is the sanctions, and this is something that is recommended under CCDBG, and the reason for this is to maintain program integrity, to deter fraud. So right now, EEC is developing a tiered sanction system that corresponds with what they call an intentional program violation definition, and it would ban individuals for 12, 24, or 36 months, depending on the frequency and the severity of the violation. So CCDBG does allow states to impose sanctions for what they call intentional program violations, and they allow the state to define exactly what those what that is. So EEC will define intentional program violation as willfully failing to report a non-temporary change, with the exception of a cessation in parents' work, training, or education participation within 30 days from the date the change occurred. We'll also include non-payment of fees, including the fees associated with excessive absences, as an intentional program violation. So now, a failure to pay fees will not immediately result in a parent receiving a 12-month ban under this sanction system. So essentially, there would be, that'd be 3 instances of a parent not paying fees to be subject to an intentional program violation. The way it would work is that after the first week that the parent doesn't pay their fee, they would be issued a warning notice from the provider. They have 1 week to come into terms with their balance. If they do not after that 1 week, a 2-week termination notice would be issued. At the end of that 2 weeks, if they still haven't come to terms with their balance, then they would be terminated from care, and that would count as 1 instance of a non-payment of fees. Now, if they were to do that 3 times, that would rise to the level of the first tier of the intentional program violation, which would result in a 12-month ban from the system. Now, this tiered sanction system is the most common among all the states, so it's something that the majority of states have something in place for initiating sanctions, and the tiered system is the most common.
So, can I just ask just a small question? The notices in writing that are provided to the families?
You're talking about the attendance?
Well, any of these, a 12-month ban, is anything in writing, or are they all in writing, or are some of them oral?
So they'd all have to be in writing, in some way, either electronic or physically in writing.
And what about families who aren't literate? How do we notify them?
So I think we'll have to try to figure that out. I mean, currently, they're already receiving notices in certain ways, so I think we just have to make sure that we
They have
address it.
arrangements like with the CCM
Yeah.
and ACT or a
Mhm.
translator.
Exactly, yeah.
They might have it, I just wanna make sure that that's in place
Yeah,
for this.
we'll make sure.
Cause they could get notices and just put them aside.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next topic is the parent fee, and again, this is something that is required under CCDBG. So the rule does not allow a parent fee to be increased during the 12-month authorization period. And they also set the benchmark at a parent fee at 7% of the parent's income. But there are states that actually go beyond this. This is just a benchmark, it's not a requirement of the 7%. Now, as far as the increase in the parent's fee, again, they won't allow a fee to be increased with the exception that if the parent fee is decreased at some point, so if a parent voluntarily reports that they lost their job and they had a reduction in income, we can reduce the fee. And then if they were to get another job and their income goes back up, we can increase the fee back to the original amount. We can't go above where we originally set for in the 12-month authorization period. So that's the one caveat. We are allowed to reduce at any point and not go above that initial threshold. Now, EEC is also in the process of creating a new fee chart, and we are currently working with the Harvard Graduate School of Education and getting proposals from them to align our fee chart with this criteria.
So even though the fee chart is not yet set, do we have any understanding of what the difference is between our current parent fee structure and the 7% benchmark?
So that was actually, it was our class at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and they did some of that analysis. And what they actually found, it ranges actually from about 5% to about 14%. And it's not very logical. To be quite honest, we don't know how our current fee chart was even set. Nobody remembers even when it was created. We have a date at the bottom of 2001. And so what they actually found is that currently families at lower incomes are paying a higher percentage of their salaries towards parent fees. And so it's a curve. So it goes up and then it starts to decrease as a parent's income goes up to a lower percentage. So, which is the exact opposite of what you actually want. So that's, so we do have that analysis from them as kind of where the current state is and then to then modify it. So in the changed fee chart, it is quite likely that some parents will have to pay more and then a lot of parents will be paying less.
So I get that on the individual level. What I'm interested in understanding is if the overall amount of parent fees coming into programs is going to be reduced. And if so, by roughly how much? So that as we think about rates and payment, we can have an understanding of that context as we are working to stabilize program and program quality.
Yep, so that's also something we're looking at because that's also, we have to also think of it from the finance side, whereas the state makes up that dollar value if it's not paid for by the parent. So whatever changes we make could potentially have budgetary impacts. And both the Learn to Earn group had already done some cost analysis of some different scenarios and what that cost would be and what that change would be, whether it would be kind of net zero to the Commonwealth or whether it would cost slightly more. Those are the types of things that we're looking at as we're looking at what we're doing with the fee chart.
That's helpful.
Just for context, the Learn to Earn group is a broader group of state agencies that are looking at the impacts of cliff effects and what we might be able to do to better tighten in-line eligibility across programs that families might, in a fairly consistent pattern be accessing simultaneously so that these programs aren't in conflict with one another and there's an opportunity for reinforce. Part of the impact analysis that I mentioned earlier, the categories of impact analysis include this parent fee issue. To your point, Joan, we don't want to create an unintended consequence in terms of adopting a parent fee approach that's not sustainable from a budgetary standpoint. The 5 to 14% range that Carol mentioned, I think it would be important to note that more families fall beyond the plus 7%. It's really between 7 to 14% for most families. There's a small percentage of families that are below the 7%. Now the 7% is a benchmark. It's not a federal requirement. It's a benchmark that they want states to be mindful of. What we do know from what we've seen from other states is that where we are in that range between 5 and 14% is not inconsistent. Most parent fee structures are in that teen range that we find ourselves in. We are concerned about that bell curve that was referenced there as well. So we want to bring something forward to the board ultimately that's sustainable. It's takes into consideration the federal benchmark and also takes into consideration these Learn to Earn principles that I think we're all trying to address, across the multiple agencies, and are equitable to families in ways that our current parent fee structure are not. So that's how we're approaching it.
So the last topic area that we'll go into is the provider responsibilities related to the parent fee. Again, this isn't something specifically addressed by CCDBG, but is a change that EEC will be making. So what we'll require in regulation is that all parent fees be collected on a weekly basis with payment made the Friday before the service week begins. Any alternative payment structure must be agreed upon between the provider and the parent. So a provider can't necessarily force a certain payment structure on a parent. They both have to agree to that. Now, as I noted before, upon the first occurrence of a failure to pay a parent fee, the provider should issue a parent a termination warning. If the parent is unable to satisfy the balance after that 1 week, then a 2-week termination notice will be issued. Now, providers who allow parents to accrue more than 3 weeks of these unpaid fees will be responsible for any balance for the unpaid fee, which is in excess of those 3 weeks. So they will be accounted for those 3 weeks, but anything they allow it to continue, they won't be allowed to recoup that amount. Now, a provider's failure to collect parent fees in excess of 3 weeks will also be a regulatory and a contractual violation, which may include termination of a contract agreement. So as far as next steps, so we are looking, we understand that there is going to be a potential cost impact, especially for fiscal year 2020. So right now, EEC previously included a $5 million as part of its FY18 and FY19 budget estimates as a first attempt to provide funds to cover the increase in costs related to this 12-month authorization. So right now, it's in the process of completing analysis of a potential cost to better refine the cost of any regulatory changes prior to the finalization of the draft regulations. So once we have this information in hand, EEC will share these findings and any associated recommendations with the board's fiscal and oversight committees, as well as the CCDBG ad hoc committee. So we believe this work will inform EEC's recommendation to the board regarding the timeline for finalizing the proposed regulations, the public process engagement, and adoption.
Thank you very much. We'll stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll move to our final agenda item, which is an update on where we're at, the agency is at with QRS development. Welcome, Anita and Amy.
Good afternoon, Secretary, Chair of the SOAP, Commissioner Weber, members of the board, and nice to meet you, David. Please, if I use any acronyms or anything that need clarification, please feel free to stop.
That probably would have been a nice thing for us to say.
Yeah.
Yes. 1 or 2 hours in.
I live in a world of those, so I understand.
I was just really realizing even our cover slide, QRS development update, so please, this is an issue we've talked about many times before, so we're just here to give you an update. My name's Anita Moeller. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Program Administration, and I'm very proud to introduce my colleague here, Amy Whitehead-Plow, as our new Director of the Program Quality Unit, no longer only Supervisor of the Program Quality Unit, and really recognizing her work in managing this unit and the staff within. So many congratulations to her on this great work. So we're going to give you an update on our quality rating and improvement system, which is, we have one currently in existence, and we're in the process of reforming it through the development of a new set of standards. So really the purpose of the meeting is to give you a really brief overview of the survey that was conducted. As you know, we had 100 days of input. It was more or less 100 days after your vote this summer to move our draft standards out for public comment. And as part of that, there was a survey, and we'll talk about the survey and some very high-level preliminary responses, overview of what we learned from that survey. We only just received the report about a week ago, just under a week. So we'll be bringing more details of that survey to Thursday's committee meeting. But we'll give you a high-level overview of what we found. and then talk about how that's impacting the development of the standards and how that fits into our broader work in terms of developing a QRIS system writ large. That's the plan in 9 slides. Get you out early. Any luck. So we had a survey which was developed and implemented by the Wellesley Centers for Women and was available online. It was in English, and a Spanish version was available for the family childcare sections of the survey. And the survey, we have 4 sets of standards, one for each type of care: family childcare, center-based, public school, and out-of-school time programming. There was a survey for each type of care. It was the same survey, but tailored slightly different to each type of care. And the family childcare piece was made available in Spanish, since many of our family childcare educators are Spanish speaking. The survey response was really tremendous. We received 1,400, almost 1,500 surveys, and 1,100 of those were completed. So that was fantastic, and we put the Spanish survey out a little bit later and received very quickly 120 responses, which 60% were complete. So we feel like we had a really good response rate. And across the different types of care, we also, each type of care was really well represented. For example, 59% of our QRIS are family childcare educators, and 44% of the survey rate was family childcare educators. Center-based care represents 24% of those in our QRIS, yet 43% of those that responded to the survey. Out of school time is 13% of our participation in the QRIS, and 8% of the survey responses came from them. And then public school is only 4% of our current QRIS participation, yet we received 6% response rate for public school programs. You have a question?
So these are the response
Those are
rates?
the response rates. I'm just telling you verbally
Okay.
the overall QRIS participation rates, put that in context for you. And then the survey was designed, as I said, to ask each type of care a set of questions that was about each of the standards. So individuals could go in and comment on each standard to say, do I like this standard, and do I like the criteria within each standard? Do they build towards quality in their progression across what we're still calling levels at the moment? And there was a quantitative form that they could respond, and there was also open-ended text boxes where they could respond through text also for each of the questions. Didn't take people long. We tracked, it was about 14 minutes per survey, and we received thousands of comments, which had to be tabulated and organized by the researchers. So I feel like as a survey, it went well. And we received no complaints actually this time. Prior survey had some suggestions that we received. And so very high level response is that folks support the standards as we put them out. Over half of the respondents strongly agreed with the standards, and another 31% somewhat agreed. So if you get the somewhat agreed or strongly agreed, are these standards the standards that we should have in Massachusetts? The preliminary overriding answer is agreement. When we also asked a question about how hard will these standards be for you to meet? Will it be really hard, somewhat easy, or very difficult, somewhat difficult, or very difficult for your program to meet these standards? We hit what I would say is what we would hope for, is that the response wasn't like, oh yeah, piece of cake, these will be easy to meet, or, oh no, we could never meet these, these are just too difficult. Really fell right in the middle. However, there's some variation, and we'll get into more detail about this in the committee meeting on Thursday, but generally folks felt that the standards for professional culture, professional development, and reflective practice and family and community engagement were the most challenging to meet. And the standards for curriculum assessment, instructional practice, and learning environments and interactions were seen as the least difficult to meet. However, I should note that many of the comments that accompanied this also said, well, we'll know more when we know what your verification process is, how hard or easy this will be to meet. So I want to point that out. So just in what we've received thus far, that's what we're pulling out for you today. And then in terms of the open-ended responses, I would say that, to my prior comment, a lot of the responses we received were concerned about the verification process, the guidance needed, and less about the standards themselves. As I think people are pretty comfortable with the standards, but much more anxious about, but how? How are we gonna meet these? What are the costs gonna be? What's the verification process gonna be? What training technical assistance is going to be available for us as we plan to progress through these?
And you could answer all that right away.
We had all that figured out, right? I'm sorry. We'll be working on that. And however, some of the comments did pertain to the standards themselves, and we will take all of the comments into consideration. Of course, the comments about the verification process and the guidance we will utilize as we develop those tools. And the comments about the standards, for example, some said we needed more language related to inclusion, including diverse families and diverse learners. There was some concern that the education level of the standards that was too high, it was hard to understand. For example, we dug a little bit deeper into this. Many respondents asked for clarification of terms or definition of terms. What do you mean by this? And the researchers analyzed the education level of the writing, the language used in the standards, and found it to be college-educated reading level. So it's something for us to consider as we go forward with the final set of revisions. There was some general concern about the tools, the PASS and the BASS, which are tools used for the business side, measuring the business side of the program. And we have been discussing about how some pieces of those tools could be utilized with fidelity. You can pull, we've talked to the authors of those tools, and you could pull some pieces out and make it less cumbersome for programs, yet still get some of those key elements addressed in measuring quality. So Amy's going to talk a little bit. As part of this redrafting work last summer, we also promised to the field that we would have 2 working groups meeting, the out-of-school time and family childcare groups. As you recall, Kate spoke to you over the summer, and we committed to having working groups, which Amy has been staffing and managing. So she'll talk a little bit about that work.
Yeah, those working groups, and there are 2 of them, one for family childcare and one for after-school, out-of-school time. They've been meeting regularly since October, and the participants in those groups have been incredibly helpful in helping to think through some of these points of tension with regard to the way that the systems are written now in implementation in the field. So I wanted to just highlight a couple of the things we've been discussing since October, and we still do have several meetings, 2 this month, more to be scheduled next month, leading up until we finalize the standards. But for family child care, some of the topics that we've been discussing are the role of screening and formative assessment in family child care programs, and specifically things like the frequency of screening. You know, does it need to be annual? Could it be just within 45 days of enrollment? How are your family child care educators using formative assessment practices? Tying those to curriculum, what tools specifically are folks using for screening and formative assessment? And so those conversations have been incredibly rich and very helpful as we think forward to this next draft. The business administration scale, here it is again. So there's a lot of misconceptions about the business administration scale. That's that tool that's used, and it's a valid and reliable tool developed for family child care to assess business practices and to promote business practices within family child care. And the sticking point on that has been the item around income. And so it turns out that people's reading of that item is much more stringent than the verification. So the verification calls for a much looser definition around what could be associated with income. So it's been really revealing to have those conversations with folks in that group. And I should have mentioned at the outset that we have independent family child care educators, systems affiliated family child care educators, and family child care system staff attending this working group, in addition to some EEC staff. We've paid a lot of attention to instructional practice within mixed age grouping, because this is an area that we had highlighted through one of the earlier public comment periods as being a point of tension for family and child care, not understanding necessarily the complexity. The feedback to the department was that we don't necessarily understand the complexity of how to promote teaching and learning within family and child care, within mixed age groupings, children from infancy all the way through school age. And so this has been really interesting to talk about and to think about in terms of the messaging moving forward when we think about instructional practice, to really be sure that we place that within this greater context of what's developmentally appropriate practice. And then they have continued to highlight again and again the complex role of family childcare educators, that in addition to being educators, they're also small business owners, sometimes employers, family engagement specialists, and so encouraging us to be very, very mindful of the role that family childcare educators play. So that's family. For after school, out of school time, this is a diverse group of folks from across the state who are engaged in this work with us. There's about 7 folks representing a variety of different after school, out of school time programs. They have continued to highlight the diversity of after school, out of school time programs statewide. And that's diversity in all sorts of ways. The number of hours that programs are open, the locations in which these programs are housed, whether they have their own space or whether they're in shared locations, the structure, and then of course the focus. So everything from what we might consider to be a more traditional ASOS program to something that has a very, very narrow arts focus or a STEM focus or say a martial arts focus. So to be sure that when we craft this set of standards that we're allowing for all programs within after school, out of school times to participate in the QRS. We've also talked a lot about assessment practices within after school as well. And so what's appropriate, with children in these programs, sometimes just a couple of hours a day, sometimes just 1 hour a day in some situations. What's appropriate in terms of observation and documentation? How are they working with their public school partners to take lessons learned and apply them to the activities that are happening? And there have been questions about, are we really looking at a constellation of activities, or are we looking at curriculum? So there have been a lot of conversations about that. And then as well, the role of social emotional learning. It seems like this really is emerging as this kind of thread throughout all of the after school, out of school time work, because regardless of the diverse program, there is that one element that seems to underlie all of them from the working group's perspective. And then too, we've been looking at the measurement tools for QRS. And we started with the SACRS, the School Age Environment Rating Scale, and we progressed to also talking about the APT, it's an assessment of after school program practices, and then the School Age PQA, which similarly looks at program quality in terms of after school programs. So these groups have been incredibly helpful in trying to think through these next stages of the QRS as we come to land on a final draft of the standards, and then think through verification, policy, and glossary, and all those pieces that are yet to come.
Anita and Amy, I know the next section says anticipated changes to the standards. Do you have anything a little more specific with regard to out of school time and family child care? I know there was a lot of comment and we sort of approved these based on the fact that we would really take, listen to people and what they were saying and apply it to the standards. Will we have a chance to review them before we go into final?
Oh, definitely, and we'll outline that process for you
Okay.
in the
Terrific.
subsequent slides, and even starting a little bit more deeply on Thursday in the committee meeting, which I knew.
Thank you. So this is the anticipated changes. This is high level. And so this is in response to our leadership and to stakeholder feedback. We're hoping to incorporate some of these changes into the final draft of the QRS standards. And the first is really thinking about repackaging the standards in a new way. We've heard a lot of feedback about the way in which the QRS currently appears. And so rethinking that and repackaging the standards to reflect anticipated goals to be achieved by each level. And really ensuring that each of the levels within the QRS has a discrete goal. That's going to be an important next step that we bring to the final draft. Please note as well, this may result in fewer criteria as the achievement of some criteria assures attainment of others. So what we're looking to do really is to streamline even more significantly at this point. And noting the goal or goals that are critical accomplishments for each level, we're going to articulate that as clearly as we're able to and to associate key criteria with each of the goals that we're articulating. And just an example, I know this is kind of a lot. It's in our heads at this point, it's not on paper, but to think about attainment of a high level, say for instructional practice. So if you are demonstrating a high level of instructional practice, we can also be pretty sure that you're demonstrating effective use of curriculum and formative assessment practices as well. So that's kind of thinking of, say, instructional practice as maybe an umbrella under which curriculum and formative assessment also live. So we're thinking of the structure of this a little bit differently from how we have in the past. We do want to take very seriously the notes that we've received about using more clear and straightforward language in the final draft of the standards, noting as well that we have professional jargon within our field, and we want to ensure that we are being knowledgeable and promoting the use of some of these terms that are common terms to our field. And so we do still, I want to reassure folks, expect to develop a glossary that will be tied to the QRIS standards. We received some comments as well that we need to do a better job focusing on inclusion in this final draft and addressing needs of diverse families and diverse learners in the final draft. So we're going to look at that very closely. And then whatever is developed both now and in the future, we want to be sure is fully integrated with the developing workforce priorities here in the department and across the rest of the work in the agency. So, what's coming next for us with regard to the final draft of the QRIS standards? So the first thing we're doing beginning this week in my unit, and I apologize because we were snowed out last week, this was meant to begin last week, but we're going to begin to dive into the final draft of the standards. So we're sharing the final survey findings and the plan changes to the standards with the board committee on Thursday. This Thursday is also our unit's first time to really dive into what might this look like in the final draft, and so we'll be sharing our thoughts with you then. We will also be continuing that work through February 5th or so, continuing to put into place the elements that we need to ensure that the final draft of the standards is easy to understand, brings all of the elements that we have been discussing so far, but in a new format that's repackaged and more streamlined. We also want to bring the changes to the standards and the design for review to all of you. So the two workforce committees that are coming up are on January 11th and February 7th. There's a board meeting on February 7th, so we'll be here again then, talking about the, right,
If needed.
right, no need if necessary.
No, but the board meeting is February 13th.
Oh, then that's a typo, thank you
Okay,
kindly.
thank you.
Appreciate that. Yeah, 13th, we'll be here if necessary. And we also will be meeting with our regional directors at EEC in February so that we can continue to think this through with our licensing colleagues, and then through an all-staff webinar in February as well, so that we can continue to get feedback from our colleagues here at the department to ensure, again, that this is fully aligned across all of the work that we're doing. We also want to ensure that we get back to the public and to all these folks who took the time to weigh in on the development of the standards. So we are planning to post the final draft of the standards to our website on February 26th, and then we're planning a field webinar for February 28th. So folks would be able to listen in and hear what has happened since they last weighed in on the survey. And then all of that moves forward into March with board consideration and fingers crossed endorsement. With a final draft of the standards to be shared with all of you on March 5th. Workforce committee meeting will be March 7th, and then a board decision regarding endorsement on March 13th.
I want to say the word endorsement there is purposeful, because whether or not you technically need to vote or not, it's not a legal document, so that's for you to decide. But I also acknowledge that there are pieces of the QRS that won't be finished until our workforce work is finished. So our career lattice and our credentialing and all that work, which needs to intersect with the QRS. So there are placeholders in our QRS right now saying that we need to connect with that work as it develops. So what we're planning to bring you is what we have on all our standards, with the understanding that that piece is developing, and with your approval, say, okay, we're gonna call this chapter closed for now and move into what's our next slide, is the continuing development of the system. Did you do that? Oh, you did? Oh, thank you. Which I'll just highlight for you. There are a lot of pieces in developing the QRS, and the standards are one piece. So we also, as Tom spoke about earlier, are working on this IT infrastructure and coming to the state with a capital request in February. We have the opportunity to think about, we've talked to you in the past about a hybrid design where we can develop a point system for the higher levels of the QRS, but we need to determine what are those points, what are they associated with, so that would be also a next step, is looking at that. coming up with interim changes to the current QRS, because it will be some time before this new system is rolled out in an IT system in the field and ready to go with a verification process. So in the meantime, we feel like there's some relief we can provide to the field with the current system by removing some of the areas that the validation study found weren't as significant, and streamlining our current QRS with some tweaks in the meantime that we could do in the interim. We need to align with our workforce efforts, as I said. There's a lot of policy that needs to be developed to provide programs the guidance that they will need, and the verification process that needs to go along with this, and identify the costs and professional development associated with moving through the QRS. And we need to figure our own staffing needs in terms of, right now, Amy supervises 3 people. That's our quality unit. Small but mighty, that's right. What will be our process? As the verification process develops, we also need to think about what is the system through which that happens. And for that reason, we have an asterisk next to those last 3 key areas, because they'll likely represent a significant component of what we ask for in their FY20 budget request, when this is more crystallized and we can come more concretely to you with a plan for this is what it's going to take and what it's going to cost to move the system forward. And that's it. We're here for any further questions, comments, discussion.
Sort of an easy question.
Oh, good. You always do, Julia.
In terms of the feedback from the surveys, was there a feeling one way or the other, or a determination on your part about education credentials?
There was a lot of comment, and you can speak to this in too as well. And like I say, we're just reading the whole 120 pages of the report, but there was a lot of comments saying we want more information about that. We need more information about what the workforce requirement side is going to be. Does that answer your question?
That's addressing it, right. I mean, it's hard to look at one thing without looking at the whole of the other parts of it, and I know you're dealing with that on a daily basis. But there was such an issue with the degree requirement or no requirement, and what level are we going to be at, and should it be included or not included. It was a difficult subject.
Can I,
We fell on it.
Yeah, I guess I'd supplement Anita's response with, we just got the report, so I think our honest answer is I don't think we know enough yet about what we got back to be able to say that there is a consensus opinion in one direction or the other, or if there's enough actually in the responses that we got to say that there was even a consensus opinion with respect to that, which is why I think we've mapped out a 2-month period. Originally, at the beginning of this fiscal year, we had thought we might come to the board by February with a proposed set of revisions, but we realized that we're going to need, at least this month to really dig in, which is why we've tried to set some stepping stones from here through March to be able to get to that piece. So, but I think I'm glad you raised your question, Joni, because we'll be mindful as we're digging through about that question, and I think it's one that's important. And I think it also speaks frankly to, there's the questions that this board has been asking. The issues, not surprisingly, that the field's raised as its, questions and concerns are the ones that we've been discussing. And it's in part informing what Anita has laid out as we're thinking about March as sort of an affirmation of that work, understanding that we're probably going to need to bring it all back as a package with the workforce and professional qualifications components laid out, which may result in some further tweaking to some of the things that we feel good about in March, but need to be reflected upon further with consideration of where we landed the workforce components over the summer, and give it back to the board as something that's fully fleshed out, which we've talked about in the past, but now as we're getting further into the work, I think we actually see the sequencing a little bit more clearly in a way that we can now play it out on a calendar.
So I guess one process consideration is whether it stays at the ad hoc level and only comes back to the full board once the workforce piece is built out, since there's likely to be some iteration. We might think about that, is whether that time in March is time well spent at the full board level.
we will defer to the board as
Yeah,
far
we
as what
can-
you resolve is the
And
best
we can
approach.
certainly keep it going through the ad hoc and see where we are, and if it makes sense, if there's enough to kind of go on, or we think that there's just too much contingency with the workforce and professional qualifications piece.
And the
Which is-
verifications piece to a degree
Which
as
is
well.
sort of likely, right, in a lot of respects.
Yeah. I had a process question related to the hybrid design development, which can't wait. I think that's a great direction to go in. But I'm wondering what the relationship between the development of a hybrid system and the verification standards is, and can we do this in the time frame that's defined here in the absence of having verification standards?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's certainly something to think about. The way that scope has been written is really to think about best practices from other states with regard to their systems, and so to do some of that research, I don't know that we would need a fully developed set of verification guidelines, but I think that it'll kind of be both together, you know, as we are thinking about the hybrid system. We'll also need to be thinking about the ways in which we verify, because that may have implications for the allocation of points, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that brings us to the conclusion of this month's meeting. We've got a few takeaways, but mostly we'll keep things going, and the commissioner and I will be in touch. We'll see you next month here again in Boston, and I suppose we should also think through an off-site scheduling off-site for this coming. Okay, great. Dave, welcome, thank you.
That's great.
We'll see you
Very
in
helpful.
I didn't have any this morning. I just tape too long.